my preferred vehicle is talking, I really like talking to the people that say terrible things to me online. It's like one of my favorite things to do. And for example, in the past, when people used to write to me and say that, the shooting at my high school didn't happen, or called me some awful expletive that I can't even say on stage here, I would, respond to them with a similar amount of vitriol and hatred, because I'm just like, how could you say that? That my classmates didn't die, that the pain of their parents isn't real, that the pain of my community isn't real, and that how hurtful that is. But it only reinforces them. If I go back and call them a similar expletive or something like that, as much as it might make me feel good, it's not actually going to make progress. And my job as an activist isn't to be comfortable, it's to have uncomfortable conversations to make progress. And what I've started doing with them is I say to them, look, I can respect that you don't agree with me and that you think that I'm X, Y, or Z expletive, but I can't accept the fact that I'm sure you don't want school shootings or gun violence to continue either, but there isn't anything that we can agree on. So is there anything that I could say to you that would even remotely change your mind? And I almost never can have these conversations in the public sphere where it's like actually publicly on Twitter. It needs to be in my DMs so that they don't feel the need to prove to their in-group that they're fighting a liberal or whatever. And I say, is there any amount of evidence, stories, data, anything like that I could provide you that would change your mind? And they say no. And I said, well, then I'm not going to try to debate you because you've obviously made up your mind, and I'm not going to waste either of our time. So how about instead we focus on what we can agree on? And then I go down the list of for example, the red flag law that I talked about was passed after Parkland. Do you agree that somebody who threatens to shoot up a high school and owns an AR-15 should be able to own an AR-15? And they're like, no, of course not. And I said, well, then you agree with me on that. And then I say, do you agree that we need more mental health funding for the 2/3 of gun deaths that are suicides? And they almost always say yes. And every time I have those conversations, it's remarkable because I've learned how to turn that hatred into hope, because they almost always end up apologizing if they continue talking to me. And it's so gratifying to take somebody that is expecting a vitriolic and hateful response and getting them to actually apologize to you because they feel like a huge asshole. And it is so gratifying. But you can't do that when it's in the public sphere. I think sometimes you may not even be able to do that necessarily in a classroom setting because somebody's worried about how they'll look to their friends, or they're worried about how they'll look to their peers. And we all function in groups and out groups, right, psychologically speaking. And people, when they have those open conversations, a lot of the time can fear that they're going to be judged by other people. And I know that happens for liberals. I know that will happen for conservatives. It's just basic human psychology. But my advice would be having constructive one-on-one conversations with people that you don't agree with if you want to. And learning how to hold yourself back and have more self-control so that you don't just try to tear into them and call them names as much as that might make you feel better, as much as you might want to. If you really are dedicated, nothing makes you feel better than actually making progress on an issue and actually having a constructive dialogue with somebody like that, even though that person that calls me names isn't going to go up and show up with me and lobby for stronger gun laws necessarily. If I can get them to hate me slightly less, that's still progress, because then they won't fight me as hard. If I can get them to agree to support something as basic as more mental health funding for the 2/3 of gun deaths that are suicides, that is still progress. But what I'm not going to do is let this conversation be dragged on and, for example, let mental illness be used as a scapegoat when they're... Ever notice how we only talk about mental illness typically when it's a white mass shooter, right? It's like, oh, what about these deranged young men? How did they, it's just so sad what happened to them. When literally in Buffalo, New York, the man that committed that mass shooting there drove several hours to a black community because he was a self-declared white supremacist. Hatred is not a mental illness. Let's be clear about that. And mentally ill people are far more likely to be a risk to themselves than others, as we know from the 2/3 of gun deaths that are suicides. I've had conversations with young people, with a sophomore in high school when I was talking on some high school campuses when I was 18 years old. And there was a young woman that came up to me and said, I care a lot about mental health funding and everything like that. And I think it's very important, but I need to tell you, I told my guidance counselor that I had, anxiety last year and that I got put on a list of potential school shooters. That's not the society that we want to build, but that's increasingly the society we are building when we continue to stigmatize mental health more and more. But that all comes back to making sure that we're having a conversation in the right way and not letting mental illness be used as a scapegoat to avoid talking about the #1 driver of gun violence in the United States, which is both individual and systemic racism.